Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture where we are going to look at some additional ethical terms, and then we will look a little bit at Ayn Rand, the Russian-born American philosopher. But to set the scene before we get to Rand, we have to look at these terms real quick, which will relate to the ego, or the self. One of the first is what is called psychological egoism, or, mental selfishness. Well, psychological egoism holds that we are all naturally self-centered or selfish. That under this principle, we can't be anything but self-centered or selfish. It's within our DNA. All of us are. And many psychologists and philosophers, hold to this. I think of, in the ethics textbook, the author, to kind of emphasize this point, uses a scene from the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, where the mom is cutting up, this cake into different pieces, but she happens to cut, one really, really big slice, and Calvin, the little boy, is like, gimme, gimme, gimme. To which the mom says back to him, don't be selfish, Calvin. And Calvin says back to her, in other words, don't be honest. And the mom pauses and gives him the piece of cake. But, again, that's representing the notion, naturally self-centered. In other words, don't be honest. And many psychologists and philosophers hold to that. And this idea, it goes back, to ancient times. I think of a story from Plato's Republic that has gone down in history as the Ring of Gyges, which is told by Plato's brother Glaucon to their teacher Socrates. But anyway, the story talks about how this ring is found. And this ring is very similar to the Ring of Power in The Lord of the Rings. I wouldn't be surprised if Tolkien didn't get the idea for the Ring of Power from the story in the Republic. And how this ring is found, and it's found by an unjust man, and when the unjust man puts the ring on, he realizes after a while that he's invisible. And he goes around, he commits acts that are unjust. And no one is really surprised by that because he's been described as an unjust man. Well, then Glaucon goes on a little further and says, well, now imagine that there are two rings. This ring is found by a man named Gyges. Gyges is a shepherd, but he is described as a just man. When Gyges puts the ring on, he realizes after a while that he too is invisible. And he goes around and he commits acts that are unjust. Well, now an explanation needs to be given, because Gyges has been described as a just man. So why is he acting unjustly? Well, Glaucon states that he always wanted to act in such a manner, but he was afraid of getting caught. But once the ring is put on, that fear is taken away. And the overall point is that we would all act that way, or we would all do what we would want to, but we fear punishment, so we don't. And Socrates pauses for a while at that statement. But finally, he does give a response. And Socrates basically responds that someone that would act that way, there's either one or two things about them. They are either ignorant or they are sick. Out of balance, you could say. Now, granted, the Republic was written long before the period of modern science, and obviously that would be the period before modern psychology. Modern psychologists would agree with Socrates that the man might be out of balance or sick, because those that would argue that we are naturally selfish or self-centered, they would say, well, there's normal selfishness And then there's abnormal selfishness. That's someone who is extremely narcissistic and cares for nobody but himself. That's abnormal. But again, still would argue that, we are all naturally self-centered. And the part, ignorant, no, they'd say, not in the ignorance, that those people are in the right. One more, episode regarding psychological egoism, and this one involves a scene with myself. A number of years ago, it was early evening, and I was walking to my local pub, and as I'm walking by what was at the time an Asian food market, now it's a coffee house, I happened to see a woman get as far away as she could from the sidewalk, and I saw that she had a pillow, that she was placing a pillow down off the sidewalk. And I was thinking to myself, somehow, I think that this woman is homeless. And when I walked back home about an hour and a half later, there she was, sleeping off the sidewalk. And I was moved by what I saw. And I said to myself, I have a portion of a roll of quarters, about $4, that I was going to use for laundry. But somehow, I think this woman needs that money more than I do. So, I went, and I grabbed the money, and I walked back to where she was, and I said, "Ma'am," and when I called out to her, she got nervous, and I said, "No, I'm not here to hurt you. I just thought that you needed this more than I do." And she thanked me, but she refused to take the money. I would say perhaps, a feeling of pride. But I talked about the incident, on my Facebook page, and I got a number of comments about how that was such a wonderful thing and so on and so forth. But someone in this category, psychological egoism, wouldn't say that I did what I did because I cared for this particular woman. They would say I did what I did in order to make myself feel better, in order to get peace of mind. So basically what I did for myself. But once again, it relates to the notion that we are all naturally self-centered, that every action that we take, it's all somehow in our self-benefit, no matter what it is. Another term related to this is what is called ethical egoism or moral selfishness. Well, ethical egoism holds that humans can choose to be self-centered, and they should choose to be self-centered. And let me have a quick sip of water and I'll focus on this term. A major difference between psychological egoism and ethical egoism would be, in psychological egoism, you can't be anything but self-centered. In ethical egoism, you can choose to look out for others, but it's not in your best interest to do so. It's in your best interest to look out for yourself. To give an example with ethical egoism, I think of the first job that I had, I was a dishwasher at a little mom and pop restaurant. And I had worked with the same people for 3 seasons. This was a seasonal job. So you become like family. But something was taking place. I remember this was right before, or this was actually during the Labor Day holiday, where those kind of in the higher ups, the management, was, informing the cook about how the server, the waitress, was going to be let go, and how they had means of doing so to, get rid of her. And, I happened to talk to her later on, and of course no one in management told me about this. I was pretty much the bottom of the totem pole. But she told me how she was bothered by the fact that the cook knew what was going on and he didn't tell her. Well, I happened to confront him about that. And I asked him, did you know what was going to happen? And he said yes. And then my follow-up question was, well, why didn't you tell her? And he responded, he said, Cody, I have a wife and kids of my own to worry about. I can't worry about somebody else's wife and kids. Is that selfish? By definition, yes. But is that wrong? Well, I'll let you decide on that for yourself. One more term, altruism. Well, altruism is looking out for the other individual, and it's the way that most people want to see themselves as, though whether or not they truly are is a matter of debate. Generally speaking, most people that I encounter don't like to think of themselves as being selfish or self-centered. They like to think of themselves as looking out for their fellow human being, although whether or not they truly are is, again, a matter of debate. But, altruism, I would say, religious principles are in the altruistic bracket. Because one thing that religious teachings, all have in common is a notion of, being nice to one another, taking care of one another. The traditional Christian theology behind the death of Jesus of Nazareth, the founder of Christianity, is very altruistic. The notion that Jesus dies for the sins of the human race, that is very much looking out for the other individual. So, anyway, we've got these terms here that are setting the scene for, Ayn Rand, who we're going to look at next time, but we're going to stop here, and then when we come back, we will look at Ayn Rand, who argues against the ethics of altruism. So, take care. I will symbolically see you then.